My son climbed into my lap one morning and whispered something that made my stomach drop. He said, "Mommy, Daddy has a lover and they're taking your money." I laughed at first, thinking he was confused, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. That night, I checked our bank account and saw money missing. The next day, I found calls on my husband's phone that didn't make sense. I wanted to believe it was all a mistake, but what I discovered next proved everything my son said was true. That morning should have been like any other breakfast, cartoons, and the sound of the kettle. Instead, it felt like the ground under me cracked open. My son's words replayed in my mind, each time cutting deeper. I tried to focus on packing his lunch and finding his socks, but my hands felt heavy. My husband was already gone for work, like always. He left early, came home late, and said it was for us. I used to believe that. Now I wasn't sure if he worked for us or against us. At work, my mind wasn't really there. The phone rang, people talked around me, but all I could hear was my son's voice. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe he overheard something on TV, but kids don't lie like that, not with that kind of fear in their eyes. During lunch break, I checked our bank app out of habit. The balance looked lower than usual, but I couldn't remember what bills had gone through. I told myself I'd look again later. Still, a strange weight sat in my chest all day. When I got home, the house was quiet. My husband texted saying he'd be late again. Late again, those two words had become part of his vocabulary. He said there were deadlines, but I couldn't recall the last time I saw proof of this work. Dinner sat warm for hours before I finally put it away. I tried to sleep, but the light from his side of the bed stayed off. When I heard his keys at the door close to midnight, I pretended to be asleep, wondering what he'd say if I asked. The next morning, I made breakfast, like nothing happened. I smiled, asked about his day ahead, but I was watching his face closely. He avoided eye contact, checking his phone between bites. I saw a tiny smile when a message came in. When I reached to pass him coffee, he flipped the screen over too quickly. I noticed the habit now. It wasn't random. My son watched him too, with quiet curiosity. I wanted to believe we were still a normal family, but normal families didn't hide messages and secret smiles before leaving the house. By the weekend, I noticed something else. His paycheck was smaller. When I asked, he said taxes changed. It sounded believable, but the math didn't add up. I'd been handling our bills for years. I knew every number by heart. I nodded and let it go, but later I opened the statement again. A new deduction appeared with no name beside it. It wasn't medical or insurance, just a blank label with money gone. I took a picture and saved it. It felt wrong, but part of me knew I'd need it later. Sunday came and we visited my mother. She's the kind of woman who can sense when something's off. She pulled me aside while my husband played with our son. She said, "Baby, you look tired. Is everything all right at home?" I smiled, said I was fine, and quickly changed the subject. But she wasn't fooled. When we were leaving, she held my hand a second longer and whispered, "Trust your instincts." Her words followed me the whole ride home. I didn't want to believe she was right, but deep down I already did. That night when he took off his jacket, I smelled something faint and sweet, perfume. Not mine. He said a coworker gave him a hug, that it must have rubbed off. The way he said it sounded practiced, like he'd used it before. I told him it was fine, but something shifted in me. I started paying attention to small details. The times, the smells, the way he smiled at his phone. I began saving everything, screenshots, receipts, anything that didn't fit right. My heart ached doing it, but I couldn't stop. It was my new kind of survival. Days turned into a pattern. He worked late, came home tired, barely talked. I stopped asking questions, letting silence do the talking. One night my son asked why Daddy sleeps on the couch sometimes. I told him Daddy's just tired, but deep down I knew the distance wasn't rest, it was escape. I lay awake that night, listening to the faint sound of him texting. The glow from his phone flickered through the hallway like a reminder. I realized I wasn't part of his world anymore, just someone waiting in the background of it. On my day off, I decided to clean his car. It was something I used to do out of love, but now it felt like searching for the truth. Under the seat, I found a mug from a cafe we'd never been to. A lipstick stain curved along the rim, not my shade, not my brand. I stared at it for a long time before setting it back exactly where I found it. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. I needed proof that even he couldn't talk his way around. Later that night I checked our bank app again. More money missing. Not large amounts but steady. Like someone slowly bleeding the account. I opened each transaction, seeing familiar stores mixed with strange ones. One payment led to a name I didn't know. I wrote it down. I told myself it could be work-related, maybe a vendor, but my gut twisted. I searched the name online. It belonged to a woman living just a few miles away. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to dig deeper or close the laptop and forget. I spent that night pretending to watch TV. My husband sat beside me scrolling on his phone, laughing quietly to himself. I wanted to ask who he was talking to. Instead, I asked about dinner plans. He said he had to work late again. My chest tightened, but I smiled. I had to stay calm, had to let him keep thinking. I didn't know. I was scared of the truth, but I was more scared of being caught unprepared. I went to bed early and waited for the sound of his car leaving again. When the house was finally quiet, I got up and checked his desk drawer. Bills, receipts, random papers. But under it all, a small card holder caught my eye. Inside, a hotel rewards card. The kind you get after multiple visits. My pulse slowed as I stared at it. He had stayed there often. My husband, the man I built a life with, had his own routine somewhere else. I slipped the card back in place, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor until sunrise. I didn't cry, not yet. The next morning I couldn't look at him the same. Everything he said felt rehearsed, every smile like a cover. When he hugged me before leaving, I didn't hug back. My son noticed, asking if I was mad at Daddy. I said no, but even saying that felt like lying twice. I made breakfast, packed lunch, did everything as usual. But inside something quiet was shifting. I didn't want revenge. Not then. I just wanted answers. And a way to protect what was left of my life before it disappeared completely. At work, a coworker mentioned seeing my husband at the mall last week. He looked nice, she said, and the woman with him had a beautiful coat. My stomach tightened, but I smiled like it was nothing. I went to the restroom and sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection. My life looked normal from the outside. Steady job, loving son, husband with good manners. But behind that picture was something rotting. I washed my hands, fixed my hair, and walked out with a decision forming in my mind. I'd find the truth myself. That night when he came home, I didn't ask anything. I made his dinner, packed his lunch, kissed my son goodnight. But once he was asleep, I opened my notebook and began writing dates, times, and strange details. Every late meeting, every deposit that didn't make sense. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity. I had spent years trusting without question, but trust without proof had cost me too much already. Whatever truth waited ahead, I was going to meet it head-on, even if it broke the rest of me to pieces. The next morning my son asked if Daddy would be home for dinner. I told him yes, even though I already knew the answer would be no. I packed his school bag and watched him walk out the door with a smile that looked too much like mine when I used to pretend everything was fine. When he came home that night, I noticed he avoided the kitchen. He grabbed food, ate in the living room, and scrolled on his phone like a teenager. I wanted to ask where he'd been, but something in me stayed quiet. My silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. He talked about work problems I'd never heard of before. Each sentence felt made up on the spot. I nodded, pretending to listen. He didn't notice my eyes drifting to his jacket pocket where his phone sat buzzing softly against the fabric. Later, while doing laundry, I found another small clue. A hotel receipt tucked deep inside his jeans. Different date, same hotel name. The total showed dinner for two. My hands trembled, not from surprise but from recognition. It confirmed everything I'd been trying to deny. I folded the jeans neatly and placed the receipt in my notebook. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the cheating or the fact that he used our shared money for it. It was like he wasn't just taking love from me but the life I'd worked so hard to build. I started checking the bank app every night after putting my son to bed. The withdrawals were steady and deliberate, always on Fridays. The pattern made me feel sick. I began tracking them in a separate notebook, marking each one with dates and notes. I had become my own investigator, collecting evidence that I wished wasn't real. Each number told a story of someone being careless with my trust. I stopped wearing my wedding ring to bed. It felt like a lie pressing against my skin, a reminder of a promise already broken. At work, I tried to focus on spreadsheets and emails, but my mind stayed elsewhere. During lunch, I searched that woman's name again. Her social media page showed photos from restaurants, hotels, and shopping trips. The timing of her posts lined up with my husband's business trips. That evening, I tested him without letting him know. I mentioned a fake charge from our account and asked if he'd noticed it. He said no, brushing it off like it didn't matter. His calmness told me everything. The old version of me would have cried right then. The new me just smiled and nodded. I went to bed early, pretending to sleep, and waited. I heard him sneak into the living room, whispering on the phone. The tone of his voice wasn't professional. It was the same softness he used to save for me. In the morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He even kissed my forehead before leaving. I forced a smile, pretending I didn't know about the call. As soon as he left, I opened his laptop. He usually kept it locked, but this time it wasn't. Inside his email, I found a folder named Consulting Files. It sounded like work, but inside were messages, intimate, familiar, and full of words that used to belong to me. My stomach clenched as I scrolled through the photos attached, each one proof that our home had become a stage for lies. I copied the emails onto a flash drive. My hands were cold the whole time, but I didn't stop. I told myself this wasn't about revenge, it was protection. My son deserved better than a father who could lie so easily. That night, when my husband came home, I sat with him on the couch, pretending to be relaxed. He asked if I was okay, and I said I was just tired. He smiled, thinking I was still blind. I smiled back, knowing that soon he'd realize how wrong he was. The next few days, I started tracking his movements. I noted the times he left, the calls he took outside, and even the gas receipts. Every small thing painted a clearer picture. My son's innocent words had uncovered something that was eating our lives quietly. I didn't confront him yet. I wanted to see how far he'd go. Each night, I updated my notes before bed, turning betrayal into data. It was strange how methodical I'd become, how heartbreak could teach discipline. My emotions had turned into focus, sharper than I ever thought possible. One evening, my coworker asked if I wanted to grab coffee after work. I almost said yes but stopped when I remembered I needed to get home before my husband. If he saw me late, he'd use it as an excuse to flip the blame. That's how liars work. They twist suspicion before it hits them. I got home early and sat in the dark living room, waiting. He came in smelling like cologne. I'd never smelled before. He didn't notice me sitting there. I watched him slip off his shoes, check his phone and sigh with relief. He looked peaceful, comfortable in his lies. I felt like an outsider in my own home, watching a stranger live beside me. I thought about confronting him right there, but something held me back. I wanted him to believe his secret was still safe. I needed time, I needed proof. So I greeted him like nothing was wrong, kissed my son goodnight and smiled at the man who had turned our marriage into an illusion. I knew now that pretending was my weapon, and silence was the only shield I had left. That weekend he said he had a conference out of town. I nodded, helping him pack like a supportive wife should. When he left, I followed my plan. I called the hotel on the receipt I'd found. I told them I needed to confirm a booking. The receptionist said he was already checked in, with another guest under the same room. I thanked her and hung up before my voice could break. I sat on the floor for a while, staring at the wall. It was no longer about guessing. Now I knew the truth. The next morning I woke up determined. My fear had turned into clarity. I packed my son's lunch, smiled like normal, and dropped him at school. Then I went home and opened my husband's laptop again. I printed everything: emails, transactions, receipts. I made copies of his call logs and saved photos on a second drive. Every click felt like reclaiming a part of myself. I realized I wasn't scared of losing him anymore. I was scared of losing myself if I didn't act. That thought gave me a strange, calm kind of strength. By the time he returned from his trip, I had everything organized neatly in a binder. He walked in smiling, carrying takeout as if nothing had changed. I wanted to throw it at him. Instead, I thanked him and set the food aside. He asked if I missed him, and I said yes, but inside I was counting the hours until I'd leave him. That night, I couldn't sleep. My son mumbled in his dreams, calling for me. I held his hand and whispered that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure how yet. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to stay with me. Stories like this are hard, but they're also reminders of strength. If you're still watching, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. It helps me keep sharing these stories that matter. Now back to that night, because that's when everything started to turn. After putting my son back to sleep, I sat on the couch staring at the binder of proof. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. My mind kept circling around one question: why? I could understand falling out of love, but stealing from your own family, that was a different kind of cruelty. I thought about the woman whose name appeared in those transactions. I wondered if she knew she was part of destroying a home. Or maybe, just like me, she had believed his lies. Either way, I needed to see the full truth. The next day I started watching patterns in his schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday he came home late and showered immediately. On those days I checked our bank app and saw small transfers to the same account. I followed the trail until I found a joint account under both their names. My name had been used once to verify it. My chest tightened, not from heartbreak, but from betrayal that felt deeper than love. It wasn't just cheating anymore, it was identity theft. He was living another life, using pieces of mine. That night I found a small voice recorder in an old drawer. I'd bought it years ago for college notes and never used it again. I charged it, slipped it behind the couch, and pressed record. I needed to hear what he said when I wasn't listening. The next day, while he thought I was running errands, I checked the device. I heard his voice on the phone, calm, confident, promising someone he'd move the rest of it soon. My stomach turned. He wasn't just hiding money, he was planning to drain what was left. I sat in the car outside our house for a long time that afternoon, gripping the steering wheel. My whole life was inside those walls, but part of me wanted to drive away and never return. Instead, I went back in and smiled like nothing was wrong. My son asked if Daddy was home, and I said yes. I didn't want to ruin his small world before I fixed mine. I knew I had to be careful now. Every step mattered. Every smile, every meal, every quiet night, it all had to look normal. One afternoon, I decided to check his car again. Under the passenger seat, I found a small box wrapped in ribbon. Inside was a key. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it wasn't for our house. I took a photo and put it back. The next day, while he was at work, I followed an address printed on a crumpled receipt in his glove compartment. The address led me to an apartment complex on the other side of town. The manager mentioned a lease under my name, and that's when my knees nearly gave out. The apartment was real. My name was forged on every paper. He had built a second life using my identity. I thanked the manager quietly and left before I broke down. Sitting in my car outside, I tried to process it. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was theft of everything I was. He hadn't only cheated on me, he'd stolen my trust, my name, and my credit. I called my best friend, but when she asked if I was okay, I couldn't answer. I just stared at the key photo glowing on my phone screen. When he came home that evening, I watched him closely. He laughed with our son, told jokes, and acted like the world was perfect. I smiled too, but my eyes burned with quiet rage. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I needed to know who she was, the woman helping him build this fake world. I searched her name again that night, scrolling through her pictures. There was one photo taken inside the same apartment I'd just seen. My furniture, my curtains, my life, stolen and displayed like a trophy. I couldn't sleep that night. I walked through our house, touching every wall, every photo. My son's toys were scattered across the floor, his drawings taped to the fridge. This was the life I had built from nothing. I thought about how I'd worked overtime, skipped meals, and saved every cent, while the man beside me used it to fund another world. I felt anger rising, but under it was something sharper, determination. I wasn't going to cry this time. I was going to reclaim every single thing he tried to take from me. The next morning I woke up early and packed my son's bag for school. As he ate breakfast, he looked at me and said I seemed different. I smiled and told him Mommy was just stronger today. When my husband left for work, I sat down at the kitchen table with the binder in front of me. My hands no longer shook when I turned the pages. Every receipt, every email, every message, it all told one story. I wasn't the broken one anymore. I was the one who finally knew the truth. I spent that day in a haze, flipping through papers that documented every detail of his lies. It felt strange, like reading a story about someone else's life. I had worked hard to build stability, and now I saw how easily he had used it as his playground. I made copies of everything, and stored them in a folder labeled work documents, in case he ever found them. My hands shook less each time I touched the evidence. I wasn't just collecting proof anymore. I was building my way out. When my husband came home, I studied him quietly. He kissed our son, dropped his keys on the counter, and smiled like a man with no conscience. He didn't notice my eyes following every move. He asked about my day, and I told him it was good. The lie rolled off my tongue easily. He didn't realize I had become just as skilled at pretending as he was. I told myself to stay calm, to let him keep performing his act, because soon the stage would crumble under his own feet. That weekend, while he took our son to the park, I checked his office drawers again. I found another hotel card, a new one with different dates. It confirmed everything. I placed it next to the old one, labeling both. It was like piecing together a puzzle where every piece hurt to hold. When he returned, he kissed my forehead, and I forced myself not to flinch. My son showed me a drawing he made, a picture of our family. But next to his father, he had drawn another woman. I smiled weakly and hugged him tighter. That night, after my son went to sleep, I opened the drawing again. The woman in it had long hair and wore a red dress. I compared it to the pictures I'd seen online, and it matched perfectly. My son had seen her. He must have overheard something, or maybe even met her. My heart ached for him more than for myself. Children notice things we try to hide. I folded the drawing and placed it in my binder. It was more proof, but it was also a reminder of the damage already done. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. The silence pressed against me as I leaned over the sink. I wanted to scream but couldn't. Instead, I ran the water and stared at my reflection. My face looked tired, older than it should have at my age. I realized that my strength wasn't in holding back tears. It was in surviving the storm without letting it change the kind of mother I was. I dried my face, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself that I wasn't broken. Not yet. Sunday morning came with heavy clouds and a light drizzle. I decided to go to church. I hadn't been in months, but I needed something solid to stand on. During the service, I didn't pray for my marriage to survive. I prayed for the strength to face the truth. I prayed that when the time came, I'd choose peace over revenge. When I got home, my husband was still asleep. I looked at him for a long time, wondering how someone could destroy a family and sleep so easily beside the wreckage. That night, I used the voice recorder again, this time leaving it near his phone. When he thought I was asleep, he called someone. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. He talked about moving the rest of the money and said something about the account being ready. The words hit me like a wave. It wasn't just about love anymore, it was theft. I listened again and again, memorizing every word. I transferred the audio to my flash drive and labeled it simply, proof. That one word carried everything I'd lost. In the morning, he acted extra kind, as if overcompensating for guilt. He made breakfast, kissed me twice, even called me babe. It almost made me laugh. He thought I was still the same trusting woman he'd married, but now every sweet gesture felt like bait. I went along with it, letting him believe his mask still worked. When he left for work, I took the voice recorder from the nightstand and replayed his call again. His tone wasn't nervous, it was confident, almost practiced. He didn't think I'd ever find out. That was his biggest mistake. That afternoon, I withdrew half of the money from our joint account. I moved it to an account under my mother's name just in case. My hands shook as I filled out the form, but the banker didn't notice. I told her it was for family savings. It felt strange, protecting myself from the man I'd once trusted with everything. As I left the bank, the sky opened up and rain poured down hard. I stood there for a moment, letting it hit my face. It felt cleansing, like I was washing off years of lies. That night, I made dinner and watched him eat. Every bite felt like watching someone enjoy a meal they didn't deserve. My son laughed at the table, and I forced a smile to keep the peace. I couldn't let him feel the storm underneath. My husband talked about work trips again, saying how stressful things had been. I nodded and offered him dessert, all while thinking about the forged lease with my name on it. It was a strange calm, like watching a fire from behind glass, knowing you're finally learning how to contain it. The next day, I went through his car again. I found the key wrapped in ribbon still there, waiting like a clue in plain sight. I took it this time and held it tightly in my pocket. That key represented every secret door he'd opened without me. I decided to visit the apartment again, this time not as a stranger. I wanted to see how deep his deception ran. Before leaving, I looked at my son's photo in my wallet. It reminded me that this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about survival. The drive to the apartment felt longer than it was. When I arrived, I parked far away and watched from a distance. The building looked ordinary, clean, and quiet. I waited until I saw someone leave before going inside. The key fit perfectly into the door. The apartment smelled faintly of candles and cologne, the same one my husband wore. My hands trembled as I stepped inside. There were photos of them together on the shelves, and on the coffee table, my own handwriting forged on a lease document. My stomach turned, but my resolve hardened. I didn't stay long. I took photos of everything: the lease, the photos, even a stack of unopened mail, addressed to both of them. One envelope was a credit statement with my name printed clearly beside hers. That was the proof I needed. Before leaving, I noticed something else on the couch, a half-finished puzzle. Only one piece was missing. I stood there staring at it, realizing how fitting it was. Their perfect little world had a gap, and I was that missing piece they'd tried to erase. But I wasn't gone yet. When I got home, I felt both sick and strangely powerful. My husband greeted me at the door, asking how my day went. I smiled and said productive. He laughed, not realizing what I meant. That night, I placed all the new evidence into my binder and hid it in the back of the closet. Then I lay beside him in bed, listening to him snore like a man at peace. It amazed me how easily guilt could sleep. I whispered into the dark, promising myself that he'd soon face everything he'd built on my name. The next morning, my best friend called. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, she said I needed to see a lawyer. The word lawyer made my chest tighten. It made the situation real. I wasn't sure I was ready for that yet. She offered to come with me, but I said no. I needed to do this alone. I spent the rest of the day looking up family law firms quietly, writing down addresses like someone planning an escape route. For the first time, I felt like I had direction. That night, he got a call while we were watching TV. He went to the kitchen to answer, but his voice carried. I caught one line: "I'll transfer it by morning." I muted the television and listened. He ended the call quickly and came back smiling. I smiled too, pretending I didn't hear. My son was asleep on the couch beside me, his small hand resting on my arm. Looking at him, I realized what I was fighting for. It wasn't just about getting even, it was about protecting his future from the lies that built this house. The next day, I went to the lawyer. She listened carefully as I explained, showing her the binder. Her eyebrows lifted when she saw the forged documents. She told me I had enough evidence to protect myself legally and even file charges if I wanted. I felt a strange relief hearing that. I wasn't crazy and I wasn't helpless. She advised me to keep calm, to let him reveal more before confronting him. I nodded, realizing patience would be my power now. I left her office feeling stronger than I had in months. When I came home, my husband was already there, pacing. He asked where I'd been. I said I was at work. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't push. I could tell he sensed something had changed. The balance of power had shifted, and he felt it. I cooked dinner in silence while he watched me, pretending everything was normal. When he finally left the room, I smiled to myself. He was uneasy now, and that was exactly where I wanted him to be, off guard, unaware of how close he was to losing everything. Over the next few days, I kept my distance. He grew more paranoid, checking his phone constantly, even changing his passcode twice. I noticed how nervous he became whenever the mail arrived. My silence scared him more than any accusation ever could. He didn't know what I knew, and that made him clumsy. He started leaving traces, half-told stories, small lies that didn't connect. Every word he spoke became another thread in the web tightening around him. For once I was the one watching him unravel, and I wasn't rushing the moment. My son began asking more questions. He noticed how quiet dinners had become. I told him Mommy and Daddy were just busy. He nodded, but I could see confusion in his little eyes. I made extra time for him. Walks to the park, movie nights, bedtime stories. I needed him to feel safe, even if the world around us was falling apart. When he slept, I watched his chest rise and fall, and promised myself that no matter what happened next, I'd make sure he never had to carry the weight of his father's choices. One evening I found an old phone in the drawer by the bed. It was my husband's previous one, the one he said stopped working. I charged it and waited. When it turned on, I scrolled through the saved files. There was only one voicemail. I pressed play and his voice filled the room, soft, affectionate, calling someone baby. In the background I heard familiar sounds, the clinking of pans from our kitchen. He had called her from our home, while I was cooking dinner. That single message captured the exact moment my trust had died. I replayed that voicemail again and again. It wasn't just his words that hurt, it was the normalcy of it. The way he sounded relaxed, comfortable, as if betraying me was part of his daily routine. I saved the file to my flash drive and labeled it, "Call Evidence." Then I turned off the phone and sat in the dark, feeling an odd mix of sadness and focus. The more I uncovered, the less I cried. I realized tears had no use anymore. Only proof did. My silence had turned into strategy, and it was working. He noticed my calmness and started acting nervous. He began checking on me more, asking if I was okay, pretending to care. I could tell he was testing me, looking for cracks. I gave him none. I laughed when he made jokes, thanked him when he offered help, and played my role perfectly. He didn't know that every smile was measured and every word was calculated. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his quiet mirror, reflecting back everything he'd done, waiting for him to see the truth written in my eyes. That night I lay awake listening to the rain against the window. It reminded me of my childhood, of simpler days when problems could be fixed with hugs. I missed that version of life. The one before betrayal taught me how to stay still and study pain. My son stirred in his sleep and whispered something about Daddy leaving. I brushed his hair back and whispered that I was here. And that was enough. I realized my strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and waiting for the right moment to rise. Morning came and my husband rushed out the door without breakfast. I watched from the window as his car pulled away. I didn't chase him or call. I just smiled faintly, knowing I had everything I needed to end this story on my terms. The rain had stopped and the smell of wet asphalt filled the air. It smelled like something new beginning, even though everything around me still looked the same. I took the binder from the closet, placed it on the table, and whispered to myself, "It's almost time." That evening I poured myself tea and sat by the window. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets glistening under the porch light. I opened my binder again, flipping through each page, making sure everything was in order. Every receipt, email, and photo told the story of my husband's deceit. I wasn't scared anymore. I felt steady, almost peaceful. My son played quietly in the next room, humming a tune. His laughter reminded me what all this was for. I promised myself that he'd never grow up thinking this kind of betrayal was normal. Later that night I received a text from an unknown number. It said, "You don't know the full story." My heart skipped, but I didn't reply. The next morning I traced the number. It belonged to the woman, so now she was reaching out. I wondered what she wanted. Maybe she thought I'd fight her, or maybe she wanted to explain. Either way, I wasn't ready. I deleted the message but saved the number. It was another piece of the puzzle. They thought I was powerless. They didn't realize how much I had already learned. Over the next few days, my husband's behavior shifted. He became distant, but more careful. He stopped leaving his phone unattended and deleted messages immediately. It didn't matter. I already had more than enough proof. My silence unnerved him. He tried small talk at breakfast, fake jokes, meaningless compliments. I gave polite smiles and kept my calm. I knew he could sense the change, but he couldn't figure out what it was. It was like he could feel the trap closing in, but he didn't know which direction to run. That weekend he said he wanted to take our son to visit his parents. I said yes, but inside I was grateful for the time alone. As soon as they left, I pulled out the phone and laptop again. This time I went deeper. Hidden beneath layers of folders, I found a file labeled Plans. Inside were scanned documents, including one labeled New Account. It had both his name and mine, but the address wasn't ours. It matched the apartment's location. He had used my identity to open another financial line. My hands tightened around the mouse. The next day I visited the bank listed on the document. The clerk confirmed that the account existed and that I was listed as a co-owner. I asked when it was opened. She checked, then looked uneasy. 2 years ago, she said. 2 years. That meant he'd been planning this far longer than I thought. I thanked her and left, walking out into the bright daylight. The world looked the same, but I wasn't. I realized then that love hadn't blinded me. It had trained me to excuse what didn't deserve forgiveness. That night I sat on the couch with my son asleep beside me. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet. I replayed everything in my head like a movie I couldn't turn off. My husband's laugh, the perfume, the fake explanations, all of it. The storm outside had returned, and with each flash of lightning, the shadows on the wall shifted. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I wasn't afraid of anything. My life was changing, and though I didn't know what came next, I knew one thing for sure. I'd never go back. I started moving small amounts of money from our savings each day. It wasn't much, but it added up. I transferred it into an account under my mother's name, safe and untouchable. Each time I did, I felt lighter. My husband noticed me humming while doing chores, and it made him suspicious. He thought my calm meant I was happy again. I let him believe it. The more confident he felt, the more careless he became. I knew his patterns now, every habit, every lie. He had turned me into the kind of woman he feared most, aware. At dinner one night, he brought up the idea of selling our car. He said we needed something more efficient. I smiled and agreed, but said we'd need to review the paperwork together first. The flicker in his eyes gave him away. He had planned to sell it alone, probably pocketing the money. When he realized I was paying attention, he grew quiet. He ate the rest of his meal without speaking. I didn't push. I didn't need to. I just kept building my wall of quiet strength around every piece of his deceit. One morning I noticed his briefcase left open by the door. I peeked inside and saw documents from his job, some real, some fake. One had my forged signature again. I took photos quickly and placed everything back exactly as it was. When he came downstairs, he didn't notice. He kissed me goodbye and said he'd be late again. I nodded, pretending not to care. But inside I was already planning my next visit to the lawyer. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about stopping him from doing it to anyone else. That afternoon I went for a walk to clear my head. The air smelled fresh from last night's rain, and the sound of my shoes on the wet pavement kept me grounded. I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything I was about to regain. It was strange how pain could sharpen your vision. I noticed small things again, the sound of birds, the way sunlight bounced off windows, the peace in breathing freely. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not a wife, not a victim, just me, still standing. That night he asked why I was so quiet lately. I told him I'd been thinking about making changes. He smirked, thinking it meant something romantic. He had no idea I was preparing his downfall. I watched him scroll through his phone, trying to look casual. He told me he was grateful for how patient I'd been. I smiled and said nothing. Patience was my weapon now. I was letting him build his own lie higher and higher, knowing that when it finally collapsed, he'd have no one to blame but himself. Days passed and my silence became unbearable for him. He started arguments over small things: forgotten laundry, misplaced keys, late dinners. I didn't respond. I'd learned that arguing only gave him control. My calmness made him uneasy, and his temper began to slip. The more he yelled, the more I realized how much peace I'd lost trying to please him. I didn't need to match his anger anymore. I just watched him quietly, knowing that his outbursts were the sound of a guilty man realizing his time was running out. One night, the power went out across the neighborhood. The house was dark except for the faint light from my phone. I sat on the couch, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. The darkness didn't scare me. It felt fitting, almost comforting. I poured myself tea and opened the binder again, using the screen's glow to read. The pages felt heavier than usual, like they carried every piece of my past. I traced my name on the forged documents, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything. Not anymore. As the storm rumbled outside, I thought about all the promises he'd broken. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up waiting for him, believing his excuses. Each memory felt like a bruise that finally stopped hurting. I wasn't the same woman he'd married, the quiet one who forgave and hoped. No, I had learned something powerful. Peace doesn't mean silence. It means standing your ground without fear. I looked out the window, watching the lightning light up the street. Somewhere in that chaos I found my clarity. It was time to act. The next morning I made breakfast early. My husband came down looking exhausted. He said he hadn't slept well. I smiled, serving him coffee. I knew the guilt was starting to eat at him. He talked about needing a vacation, maybe some time alone to rethink things. I agreed, encouraging him to rest. He seemed surprised at how agreeable I'd become. What he didn't know was that I was preparing everything for the day he left. I'd be ready to close the door behind him and never open it again. After dropping my son at school, I went to the lawyer again. She reviewed my updates, nodding as I showed her the new photos and documents. She told me I had enough evidence for divorce and fraud. I asked about custody and finances, and she assured me my husband wouldn't be able to touch a cent. Relief washed over me like sunlight breaking through clouds. I signed the first set of papers, my hand steady. It felt strange signing my name, knowing this time it was for my own freedom. When I got home, I noticed an envelope on the counter. My husband must have left it for me. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a handwritten note, short, almost careless. It said he was sorry for the distance, that he needed space, and that he still cared. The words felt hollow, like a script written by someone pretending to understand remorse. I folded the letter and placed it in the binder. It was another piece of proof, another sign of how little he valued truth. His words couldn't touch me anymore. Not now. That evening he came home late, looking uneasy. He asked if I got his note. I said yes and thanked him for being honest. My calmness threw him off. He nodded slowly, unsure what to say. He went to the living room and turned on the TV, but I could tell he wasn't really watching. He looked lost, fidgeting with his phone, staring at the floor. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered the forged documents, the lies, the stolen money. Pity didn't belong here. Justice did. I took a walk that night after he fell asleep. The streetlights glowed softly against the wet pavement. Each step felt like a countdown. I passed familiar houses, each window lit with families inside. I wondered how many people were hiding pain behind smiles like I had. When I returned home, I stood in front of our door for a while, listening to the quiet inside. I wasn't afraid to walk back in anymore. That house wasn't a prison now, it was the place where my strength was born. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I looked at my husband sleeping and realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a clean emptiness where love used to be. I got dressed quietly and took my son's hand as he woke. We ate breakfast together, just the two of us, laughing about cartoons. When my husband came downstairs, we were already smiling. I think it confused him to see happiness that didn't include him. That morning I realized the first stage of healing had already begun, joy that no one could steal. At work I printed final copies of my documents. My coworker complimented my calm energy, saying I seemed lighter lately. I smiled thinking about how peace sometimes comes from endings, not beginnings. During lunch I walked outside, feeling the breeze against my face. I thought about the life ahead of me, a smaller one, maybe lonelier for a while, but honest. I wasn't scared of starting over. I was scared of ever forgetting how strong I'd become. I returned to my desk, ready to finish the day, like someone who finally understood her own worth. That night when I got home, the house smelled different. My husband had cooked dinner, something he rarely did anymore. He was trying to play nice again. I sat at the table and thanked him, but the food tasted strange. It wasn't about the flavor, it was about the memory. Every bite reminded me of the woman who had once believed his kindness was love. I ate quietly, thanked him again, and cleaned up afterward. When he offered to help, I said no. Some things were better done alone, like reclaiming your peace. Later I tucked my son into bed. He asked if Daddy would be home tomorrow. I said yes, but soon we'd be moving somewhere new. His eyes widened, curious but unafraid. I told him it would be a happy place with sunshine and space for his toys. He smiled and drifted to sleep. I stood there for a long moment, watching his small chest rise and fall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped in my own life. Freedom was coming, and this time I'd earned every part of it. I spent that night organizing every document again. I labeled folders, added dates, and double-checked recordings. I even printed copies of the photos from the apartment. Each piece of evidence felt like armor. When I was done, I placed everything in a box under my bed. My husband walked in, asking what I was doing. I said I was cleaning up old files. He nodded and walked away, unaware that I'd just packed up the truth that would destroy his lies. I turned off the light, feeling strangely calm, like the storm had finally passed. The next morning I dropped my son at school and sat in the car for a while. The sun was bright, the sky clear. I took a deep breath and looked at the road ahead. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked different, steady, confident, alive. I wasn't scared of what was coming. I was ready. The time for pretending was over. The time for truth had arrived. I started the car, heading toward the lawyer's office, whispering to myself, "Let's finish this." At the lawyer's office, everything moved fast. Papers were signed, statements drafted, and evidence organized for court. I felt detached, watching it all unfold, like I was signing away someone else's life. The lawyer said I'd done well to stay calm and gather proof quietly. She warned me that confrontation would make him reckless, so it had to be handled carefully. I nodded, agreeing. My husband had spent years taking from me without asking. Now I was taking back my voice, one signature at a time, and this time it was permanent. When I got home, my husband wasn't there. The house was quiet, and I used the time to make copies of every document again, storing them in a locked drawer. My son played on the floor, humming to himself. I watched him for a moment and felt a rush of warmth. He was the reason I hadn't fallen apart. I kissed the top of his head and whispered that we'd be okay. The sound of my own voice felt stronger now, like each word carried more truth than anything my husband had ever said. That evening my husband came home looking nervous. He asked where I'd been, his tone sharp. I told him I'd gone shopping. He nodded but didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He'd begun to realize something was changing. He checked his wallet, glanced at the mail, then asked if I'd seen a particular bill. I lied and said no. I let him wander around the house like a man searching for control that had already slipped away. I almost felt sorry for him, but he'd built this downfall himself. Over the next few days his behavior grew erratic. He made strange calls late at night and left early in the mornings. He looked over his shoulder more often, like a man being followed by his own guilt. I stayed calm through it all. My silence made him restless, and that restlessness made him careless. He started making mistakes, missing work calls, forgetting excuses, repeating lies he'd already told. The cracks were showing, and I knew that once he realized how much I knew, it would all come crashing down in front of him. Then one afternoon I got a call from my lawyer. She said there was new information. The woman, the one he'd been seeing, had tried to withdraw money from one of the accounts under my forged name, but the freeze I'd placed had blocked it. That small act of protection had saved what was left of my finances. The lawyer told me the police might get involved soon. I thanked her and hung up, sitting in silence. For the first time the fear was gone. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness preparing for justice. When my husband came home that night, he looked panicked. He went straight to his desk and started making calls. I could hear the desperation in his voice. I knew then that his world was starting to close in. He walked into the kitchen and asked if I'd noticed anything strange with our accounts. I said no, pretending confusion. He studied my face for a long time, then nodded slowly. He didn't realize the woman he'd betrayed was now the one holding every string to his fate. That truth gave me a quiet sense of power. The following morning he confronted me. He said the bank had called about suspicious activity and asked if I'd been there. I looked him in the eye and said calmly, "No." His voice rose, demanding answers. I didn't give him any. I let him shout until he realized his anger wasn't working anymore. When he finally fell silent, I walked past him without a word. For years he had used his voice to control the narrative. Now my silence was louder than any argument he could make. He looked small for the first time. Later that day, I received an email from my lawyer. The fraud case had enough evidence to move forward. They were building the file and would reach out to him soon. I felt both relieved and sad. This wasn't how I imagined my marriage ending, but it was the only way it could end, with truth, not lies. I watched the sunset from the kitchen window, thinking about how endings can still be beautiful when they mean freedom. I poured a cup of tea and toasted quietly to the woman I was becoming. The next week, my husband came home early from work, looking shaken. He said someone had called him asking questions about a financial inquiry. I acted surprised and asked what it meant. He said he didn't know, but I could see the fear behind his calm voice. The web was closing, and he could feel it. I made him dinner, watched him eat, and studied his every move. I didn't need to ask anything. I already knew his story was falling apart piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The following morning, a knock came at the door. It was a man from the bank's fraud department, asking to speak to both of us. My husband went pale but tried to act normal. I invited the man in, offered coffee and let him explain. He mentioned false signatures and irregular transfers. My husband tried to deny it all, but the officer handed him documents with his handwriting on them. I stayed quiet, watching as the truth took shape in front of him. For once, he couldn't talk his way out of it. After the officer left, he exploded. He shouted, demanded to know what I'd done. I stayed seated at the table, calm and still. He accused me of setting him up. I told him he'd set himself up, long before I knew anything. He paced, his voice shaking with panic, not guilt. He realized he couldn't access the money anymore. His hands slammed the counter, but it didn't scare me. I'd lived with louder storms than him. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, the woman he could no longer control. That night he packed a small bag and said he needed air. I didn't stop him. I simply told him to take all the time he needed. As he left, I locked the door behind him and exhaled. The quiet that followed was the most peaceful sound I'd heard in years. I tucked my son into bed and whispered that everything was okay. I knew he'd be back eventually, trying to explain, trying to twist the truth. But this time I had everything in writing. He couldn't erase what was already documented and sealed. He didn't come home for 2 days. When he finally returned, his face was pale and tired. He sat at the table, trying to sound calm. He said the woman had told him everything, that she had confessed to the forged papers and the money. He said he was used and manipulated. I listened quietly, knowing every word was a half-truth. He wanted sympathy, but all I felt was exhaustion. He asked if we could fix things, rebuild our marriage. I told him some things can't be rebuilt when the foundation was made of lies. He looked at me for a long time like he was searching for the woman who used to forgive him. She wasn't there anymore. I told him I'd already filed for divorce and handed him the papers. His face went blank. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. I told him he could leave now or wait for the police to escort him. He looked stunned, then grabbed his bag and walked out without saying goodbye. The silence that followed felt like victory. Days later, my lawyer called again. The fraud case had progressed. The authorities confirmed the forged documents and false transactions. He was now under investigation for identity theft and financial fraud. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't celebrate. I just sat at the table and breathed deeply. Justice didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance being restored. For the first time in years, the air in my home felt clean. I made dinner with music playing softly in the background. It felt like life was finally returning to normal. A week later, I was asked to testify. I wore a plain dress and carried my binder. When I stood before the court, my voice didn't shake. I explained everything clearly: the stolen money, the forged lease, the second apartment. The judge listened carefully. My husband avoided my eyes the whole time. I could feel his shame even from across the room. When it was over, the prosecutor thanked me for my courage. I smiled faintly, not because I felt proud, but because I had survived the hardest truth a person can face: betrayal within their own home. When I left the courthouse, the sun was shining. I stood on the steps for a moment, closing my eyes. I felt lighter than I had in years. The lawyer said I'd likely win full custody and financial recovery. It sounded like justice, but to me it was closure. I walked to my car, replaying everything that led here. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I got married, but it was the ending I needed. Some stories don't end in reconciliation, they end in freedom, and that's a kind of love too. That evening, I made dinner with my son. We danced to his favorite song, while the pasta boiled. He laughed so loud that I couldn't help laughing with him. It was the first time our home felt truly happy again. When he asked if Daddy was coming home, I told him not tonight. He nodded, accepting it easier than I expected. Children have a way of letting go faster than adults. Watching him smile reminded me that life still had beauty, even after everything. I was ready to build something new, just us two. The following week, I received a letter from the court confirming the divorce hearing date. It was set for next month. I placed it on the fridge and smiled. It felt symbolic, like pinning a new chapter onto my life. My husband tried calling a few times, but I didn't answer. I didn't need explanations anymore. I'd spent years listening to lies disguised as love. Now silence was my closure. I went about my days peacefully, working, cooking, and laughing with my son. Healing didn't happen overnight, but it was happening one honest moment at a time. A few days later, my mother came to visit. She brought groceries and hugged me long and hard. She said she'd been praying for this strength in me all along. We sat together on the porch, drinking tea as the evening breeze carried the sound of kids playing nearby. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. She smiled and said that meant I was finally healing. For the first time, I believed her. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant refusing to carry his burden any longer. I was done carrying pain that wasn't mine. The next morning, I woke up to an email from my lawyer. The court had approved a temporary financial hold in my favor. I read it twice, then smiled. It meant safety. It meant my husband could no longer reach into what was mine. I took my son out for pancakes to celebrate. We sat by the window and I told him Mommy's working on something good. He laughed and asked for extra syrup. Watching him eat, carefree and happy, I realized that my victory wasn't in revenge, it was in giving him a peaceful future. Back home, I started clearing out the last remnants of my husband's things. Clothes, papers, random trinkets he left behind. Each item carried a memory, but none of them hurt anymore. I packed them in a box and left it by the door for donation. It felt symbolic, like removing old energy from the house. When I looked around, the rooms looked brighter. It wasn't about what was gone, it was about what remained. Me and my son, our laughter, our strength, and a home that finally felt safe again. That was enough. That night, I tucked my son into bed and stayed there beside him for a while. He asked if I was happy. I told him yes, and for the first time, I truly meant it. Happiness didn't feel like fireworks or celebration. It felt like quiet peace, like knowing I'd made it through something that could have broken me. He smiled and fell asleep, holding my hand. I stayed there listening to his soft breathing, feeling gratitude for every small sound that reminded me I'd chosen the right path. Peace had finally come home. The next week, the lawyer called to tell me the investigation was officially wrapping up. My husband would face charges for the forged documents and identity fraud. Hearing those words didn't bring joy or anger, just closure. I thanked her and ended the call. I walked to the window, watching sunlight spill across the floor. Life had finally balanced itself again. I whispered a quiet thank you to the version of me who refused to give up when everything seemed impossible. She was the reason I was still standing here, whole and free. That evening, I found the old notebook where I'd written everything down, the first suspicions, the receipts, the dates. I flipped through each page, remembering how scared I'd been at the start. Then I reached the last page, blank, and waiting. I wrote one final line, "Truth always wins." I closed the notebook and placed it in the back of a drawer. It wasn't a record of pain anymore, it was proof of growth. The woman who once doubted her strength had become her own protector, and that was a story worth keeping. A few days later, I received a call from the prosecutor's office. They thanked me for my cooperation, and confirmed that charges had officially been filed. My husband was facing both financial and criminal consequences. I hung up the phone slowly, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The world didn't look different, but I was. For so long I'd lived under the shadow of lies. Now the sun touched every corner of my life again. The darkness was gone, replaced by something fragile but powerful, peace earned through pain. That night I went through my son's backpack and found another one of his drawings. It showed the two of us standing in front of a small house, holding hands. He had drawn a big smile on both our faces. For the first time in a long while, I smiled back at the paper. It was simple, childlike, and full of hope. I pinned it on the fridge where the old bills used to hang. It reminded me that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about choosing to live beyond it. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life slowly returned. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and helped my son with homework. The routine felt new again, softer. The silence in the house no longer hurt, it soothed. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and almost not recognize myself, not because I'd changed, but because I looked alive. There was color in my face again, calm in my eyes. Freedom has a way of showing on your skin when you finally stop living for someone else's comfort. One morning I received a letter from the court confirming the divorce was finalized. It was official. I held the paper for a long time, not crying, not smiling, just breathing. I placed it inside the binder that had once held all the proof of his betrayal. It was fitting that the story ended in the same place it began, with documentation, but this time of closure, not deceit. I poured myself coffee, looked out the window, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's done." The quiet answer that followed felt like peace. My mother threw a small dinner for me that weekend. She cooked my favorite dishes and filled the table with laughter. Family and friends came, each bringing warmth that my house hadn't felt in years. When someone toasted to new beginnings, I felt tears sting but didn't hide them. I wasn't crying from sadness anymore, it was release. I looked around at the people who loved me, and realized that losing one person hadn't left me empty. It had made room for real love to come back in, the kind that doesn't hurt. When we returned home that night, my son ran to his room, excited to show me a toy he'd built from blocks. I knelt beside him, admiring his work. He said he wanted to build a house one day, a big one, for just us. I smiled, promising that we would. It wasn't just a child's dream. It was a symbol of what we both wanted: safety, honesty, and love that stayed. Watching him play, I felt something strong and quiet inside me, a sense that the future didn't scare me anymore. Over the next few days I began making small changes. I rearranged furniture, painted the living room walls, replaced the old curtains. The house started to look different, brighter. Every change felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. The old memories didn't haunt the corners anymore. They faded under the new ones I was creating. When neighbors asked how I was doing, I smiled and said, "Better than I thought." And I meant it. Healing wasn't loud or sudden. It was steady, like the rhythm of breathing after holding it for too long. One morning while cleaning the closet, I found a box I'd almost forgotten: the binder, the photos, the old receipts. I sat down and flipped through it slowly. The evidence that once brought pain now felt like history, something finished. At the very back, I found the key wrapped in ribbon, the one I'd taken from his car. I turned it over in my hand, thinking about how something so small had unlocked so much truth. Then I stood up, walked outside, and threw it into the trash bin. Some doors aren't meant to be reopened. Later that week I received an apology letter from the woman. It was brief. She said she didn't know the full story and was sorry for her part in it. I read it once, then folded it. There was no anger left in me. I'd already moved beyond that. I placed the letter in a drawer, not to keep the memory alive, but as a quiet reminder that everyone makes choices they have to live with. Forgiving her didn't excuse what she'd done, but it freed me from carrying the bitterness she left behind. That evening I took my son for ice cream. We sat by the park watching kids play and the sky change colors. He laughed as the wind blew his napkin away. In that simple moment everything felt right. I didn't need a grand victory or revenge. I had peace, safety, and my child's laughter. Those were worth more than anything I'd lost. Sometimes life takes away what you thought you needed just to give you back what you truly deserve. That realization stayed with me long after the sun disappeared. A few days later, I packed away the last of his things that remained in the attic. I found an old photo of us from years ago, back when smiles were real and promises still meant something. I looked at it for a moment, then placed it in the donation box. I wasn't erasing the past, only letting go of what no longer belonged in my future. I had lived enough in pain. It was time to live in peace, and letting go was the final gift I could give myself. The divorce papers arrived with an official stamp of approval, the final seal. I signed the last section acknowledging the terms and slipped the papers into a folder. My hands didn't shake this time. I felt grounded, sure of myself. The chapter that had once consumed my nights was now closed forever. I didn't celebrate. I didn't mourn. I just stood at the window feeling the morning light on my skin. It felt like a quiet blessing, like the universe whispering that it was finally time to move forward. I started a small side business from home, something I dreamed of but never had time for. It began slowly, but each day brought progress. I found purpose in creating something that was truly mine. It wasn't about money, it was about independence. My son loved watching me work. He'd sit by the table, coloring while I typed. Sometimes he'd ask if I was happy now, and I'd tell him yes, not because everything was perfect, but because we were safe and honest again. That was the kind of happiness that lasts. Friends began visiting more often. Laughter returned to the house like it had been waiting outside the door for years. We cooked, played music, and shared stories about new beginnings. It felt strange at first to laugh without guilt, but I embraced it. My heart no longer jumped at phone vibrations or footsteps outside. The peace I had once prayed for was now my reality. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I had rebuilt myself from the pieces that betrayal left behind, and what emerged was stronger than before. One afternoon, my mother stopped by with a small box. Inside was a snow globe, missing its base. She said she found it while cleaning and thought I might like it. I turned it over in my hands, watching the flakes swirl. It was imperfect yet beautiful. I placed it on the shelf next to my son's drawings. It reminded me that life didn't need to be flawless to be worth living. Sometimes the cracks and missing parts made the story more real, more human. And I had finally learned to love that truth. Weeks later, the seasons changed. The first chill of fall crept into the air. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, sipping tea as my son played in the yard. The leaves turned gold, the sky soft and wide. I thought about how much had changed, how much I had changed. Pain had once felt endless, but now it was a memory that taught me strength. The world felt open again, like anything was possible. I wasn't defined by what broke me. I was defined by what I built afterward. One morning, I received a notice confirming full custody of my son. The moment I read it, tears filled my eyes. It wasn't just a legal win, it was emotional freedom. I had fought for this peace, for this safety. I held the paper to my chest and whispered a quiet thank you. My son ran into the room, asking why I was crying, and I told him they were happy tears. He hugged me and I realized how far we'd both come from that first whispered secret that changed everything. As months passed, I barely thought about my ex anymore. He had become a distant story, a lesson written in past tense. What once felt like a wound was now just a scar, a reminder, not a pain. I didn't check his social media or wonder where he was. I was too busy living. I'd found balance, laughter, and a life that belonged fully to me. Some nights when the house was quiet, I'd think back on how far I'd come and smile, not with regret, but with gratitude for surviving it all. One evening my son asked if Daddy would ever come back. I looked at him and said, "Only good people stay, baby." He nodded, accepting my words without sadness. That small moment told me he understood more than I realized. I tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead. When I turned off the light, the room felt peaceful. I closed the door softly, knowing I had broken the cycle. My son would grow up knowing that strength doesn't mean silence, it means standing tall, even when everything around you tries to shake you. A few days later, I cleaned out my drawers and found my old wedding ring. I turned it in my palm, the metal cold against my skin. It once symbolized love, but now it was just a reminder of lessons learned. The next day, I donated it to a charity shop. Walking away, I felt lighter. Some people think closure comes from confrontation, but I learned it comes from release. That ring no longer held power over me. My life no longer revolved around promises someone else had already broken. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years. Each night I wrote about gratitude. Small moments, tiny joys, new beginnings. Writing helped me see how far I'd come, how peace had slowly grown in places where pain once lived. I realized that strength doesn't appear overnight. It builds, quietly, in every choice to keep going. Every page became proof that even after betrayal, love, true, self-given love could grow again. I wasn't waiting for happiness to find me anymore. I was building it, word by word, moment by moment. Winter came softly. I decorated the house for the holidays, something I hadn't felt like doing in years. My son helped hang lights by the window, his laughter filling every corner. When we plugged them in, the glow spread across the room, warm and golden. I stood back, taking it all in. The house, once filled with lies, was now filled with light. I whispered a thank you to the universe, not for what I lost, but for what I gained. The strength to rebuild, the courage to forgive, and the grace to begin again. On New Year's Eve I invited friends and family over. We counted down together, glasses raised, music playing. As everyone shouted Happy New Year, I felt tears slip down my face. They weren't from sadness. They were gratitude. The year had taken everything that wasn't meant for me, and replaced it with truth. When midnight passed, I looked around the room and realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living fully, freely, and without fear. That realization was the best gift I could have given myself. The next morning I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection. I saw a woman who had been broken, rebuilt, and reborn. There were still traces of the old me, the hopeful girl who believed in forever, but now there was something steadier in her eyes. I touched the glass and smiled. The past didn't define me anymore. It had refined me. Everything I'd gone through had led to this moment, where I could finally stand tall and say, I made it through. And I truly had. That night I tucked my son into bed, turned off the lamp and sat beside him for a moment. The house was quiet, the air calm. I whispered softly, We're safe now. He smiled in his sleep, clutching his blanket. I looked around the room filled with warmth, light, and love, the kind that couldn't be stolen. For the first time since everything began, I felt completely at peace. My story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about rebirth. And as I closed my eyes, I knew we were finally home.